Would you like to have a short history of race in the city of Dallas? Gerald Britt grew up here. He's a black pastor and works for City Square in Dallas, and he knows personally that history, and will share it with you on Good God, coming right up. Welcome to Good God, conversations that matter about faith and public life. I'm your host, George Mason, and I'm here with my friend, Gerald Britt. Gerald is the Vice President of External Affairs for City Square, which is Dallas's premier agency for the public good, I would say. Benevolence work, of course, in part, but also interested in good government, in advocacy for the poor, and for opportunity to be equalized in the community. I'm not sure how else you would describe it, Gerald.
That's not a bad description.
All right.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, Gerald and I have been friends for nearly 30 years as we've been, first we were pastors together.
Right.
And we're both Baptists, by the way.
Right.
And it's really, it's a really important thing probably to recognize that when people talk about the American church, mm-hmm. they often talk about the American church as if it's one thing.
Right, right.
Or Baptists as if we're one thing.
We come in all flavors.
And we come in all flavors. And it often reminds me, Gerald, of how often people talk about evangelical Christians, and what they really mean is white evangelical Christians.
Exactly.
Yeah. They don't really take account of the different dimensions of all of that. But you've been in Dallas a long time and grew up here.
All my life.
So third generation preacher too.
Yep.
Yeah. So what was your call to ministry like? Was it the kind of thing where you almost had to figure this is the family business, or was it something that you knew God was specially drawing you apart?
It's interesting that for me it initially kind of started out as running away from the family business.
Okay.
I had thought first of all about being a professional football player. Uh-huh. Then I wanted to be a lawyer. Then I wanted to be engaged in what at that time was the social justice movement.
Okay.
I'd gone to hear Angela Davis at SMU, Dick Gregory at Bishop College. I think I frightened my mother and my grandfather to death because they didn't know what I was doing because I hadn't talked it over with them. But it was wanting to be of service to my people in a substantial way. Right. But at the same time, if I could have avoided the ministry, I would have done that. And I had a couple of coaches who had, because after my senior year I hadn't received any scholarship offers, although I got a lot of letters before then. And a couple of coaches got me a scholarship to Tuskegee Institute. Right. And I'd filled out all the paperwork and was ready to sign it, and my parents were on board. And then something just spoke to me while I was getting ready, saying, if you sign this, you're committed. And I couldn't sign it. And after that, I began thinking, and it was an impression upon my soul, which is the only way I can explain it, that made me know that the only way I would be settled and have peace was to go into the ministry. So I preached my first sermon on April 20th of 1975.
Wow. About
3 weeks before I graduated from high school.
And then you went on to where?
Bishop College.
Right.
And was Bishop College for about a year and a half. Uh-huh. And then was associate minister and my grandfather's assistant pastor for about close to 7 years.
Right.
And then joined New Mount Moriah Baptist Church because that was kind of a neutral, safe place for me.
Okay.
I didn't want to go join my father's church, and I didn't want to stay at my grandfather's church where I tell people I didn't know if I was good because the family kept telling me I was good or because I was good.
Okay.
And so New Mount Moriah, the pastor and I there, became great friends over the course of maybe a couple of years. I would go over and talk with him, and he would then tell me stuff about the church that you would not figure any pastor would tell a young preacher. And
it didn't scare you off?
No, it didn't. And then I joined there. My
Yeah.
wife and I joined there, and he began to show me even more. And May 15th of 1982, about 9 months after we had joined, he was killed in a car accident. And the deacons asked me to be interim pastor that night. They ordained me because I wasn't ordained at that time. Ordained me so I could carry out the sacraments and do baptism. And from May until September of that year, I served as interim pastor, and then they called me in September to be pastor.
Wow. And how many years were you there?
I was there 22 years.
22.
22 years.
Okay.
And I tell people that it started out as a very traditional pastorate.
Mm-hmm.
All of the trappings and all of the routine of a normal pastor in a relatively poor setting, although we didn't think of it as that. And then after a while, I got involved with Peter Johnson.
Yeah.
Peter invited me to, or I was encouraged to go to a meeting that Peter Johnson had called for pastors who were concerned about the flood that had happened in at that time what we called Bonton.
Bonton, right. And we should stop and say Peter Johnson, by the way, is a sort of legendary Dallas civil rights activist
Right.
who was part of Martin Luther King's group and
Right.
and marched and was did he work for the Southern Leadership Conference?
He did. He worked with Southern Christian Leadership Conference as an organizer and
Right.
field agent.
Right, and he's still around.
He's still here.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
still here. Still a very good friend of mine.
Good.
And he got me involved there. I was writing speeches to go before City Hall. I was writing press releases, and I myself was presenting at City Hall at the time, and just kind of finding out what that. And then he got me involved in the protest to stop the city council from appealing Judge Buckmeyer's ruling on that the city had to have single member districts.
Right.
And I remember the very first action that we had, he had me, he pushed me in the front to help lead a march of
Right.
900 people from the Kennedy Memorial to City Hall. And so there it was me, it was Zan Holmes, it was Roy Williams, it was Martin Luther King
Sure.
III.
Yeah, Marvin Crenshaw maybe?
Yeah, Marvin
Yeah.
Crenshaw.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we led that march. And that's kind of how my foray into public life began.
You know, it's interesting you say that because
Excuse me.
that would have been back probably around 1990 or
Right,
so, somewhere
right,
in there.
Right.
And the decision about the 14-1 versus the 12-4-1 plan,
Right,
which
right.
was the four at-large districts was
Right.
the other thing, was probably the first public issue I stepped out on as well in my pastorate. And I was really surprised at how much pushback I got.
Yeah.
Because it seemed only logical that if we were going to change the sense of full participation that had been denied to people in various districts in this city, that we would end up with, we needed to end up with the single member districts.
Right.
Otherwise, everything still looked like the old oligarchy was going to continue to exercise undue influence over other folks. And their argument was this is just going to create ward politics and all that kind of thing. Well, what is democracy anyway?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, really.
Exactly.
And but I remember that being a challenging time when I realized, okay, George, if you're going to step out on these things, this is the way it's going to be.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And we got pushback from the black community as well.
Did you really?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Why is that?
There were those who had benefited from the status quo.
Well, that gets into the whole accommodation thing
Exactly.
too, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there were preachers that I admired and respected,
Right.
and followed for years.
Yes.
Who were challenging us.
Yes.
On the wisdom of doing this. And so, we got pushback from all around. I think that A, we were too young to know any better.
Yes.
B, we had a sense of justice that told us that this had to happen.
Yes.
And so Peter was an excellent mentor, and he allowed us to grow into leadership while giving us a sense of the flavor of what the civil rights movement had been before.
Yes.
And so it was a challenging, harrowing time, but again, the results were worth it. And if it had not been for 14-1 passing,
right.
We wouldn't have single-member districts on the school board. We would not have single-member districts in county government,
right.
Which means there would have been no John Wiley Price. It means there would not have been an Yvonne Ewell or
right.
Kathleen Gillum or any of the
right.
ones we see today. And so, it has its drawbacks. It has not produced the type of leadership or politicians, frankly, statesmen I call them, that I had hoped it would produce. But that political maturity takes time.
Yes.
And I think it's going to take time for the electorate to grow, even though it's been, 20 some odd years. But it's going to take the electorate to grow to understand the type of leaders that we need. And it's going to take a new level of respect for that maturity.
Yes.
For it to go.
So I think it's for those who are listening or watching, who are in the white community of Dallas and throughout the United States, this is very common in cities.
Right.
There's a sense from some that the black community thinks as one, that
right.
it has a single mind about public issues and
right.
that sort of thing. But we know that's not true.
Right.
And I think it's probably helpful to be able to recognize that there are elements who are more progressive and more conservative, both in
right.
the black community just as well as in the white community.
Right.
And that's true in the churches too.
Exactly.
When you look at how the black church per se in Dallas it has evolved over the time you've been here, what observations do you have?
Well, I think that, frankly, the political influence that the black church has in the black community is overestimated and has been for some time.
Okay.
There is still political influence that it has, and it's recognized and respected as well as it should be. But as you say, the black community itself is not monolithic.
Right.
And so there are more there are more liberal voices out there, more progressive voices, one might say, who don't agree with stances that are taken by the church. There are some stances, frankly, that the church should take that it hasn't taken.
Right.
And so we've got to work on that. I think that there was, during the time when I was growing up as a pastor, and as well as before, there were more structures in place for political thought and for to give birth to politicians, the structures that gave birth, if you will, to Zan Holmes.
Ministerial alliances being one of them.
Exactly.
Which now, instead of being one or two, they're all broken up into different kinds of coalitions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when I became a pastor, there were 2 National Baptist conventions,
right.
3 state conventions, about 19 or 20 district associations. Now there are like 5 state national conventions.
Right.
I don't know how many state conventions there are or local.
Right.
And then there's the rise of the non-denominational churches.
Yes.
All of which have kind of sapped some strength away from
right.
traditional Protestant African American denominations. So there's a fracturing that takes place that calls for a new type of coalition building.
Right.
And there is this reluctance I see on the part of many pastors that I would have thought we've overcome by now to address issues substantively
Yes.
that impact our community.
Well, it's not just in your community, it's in ours too. And I hate that we continue to have to say your community and our community
Right.
when this is our community altogether.
Yeah.
But let's take a break and come back and address some of those things that we'd like to see the church address more distinctively.
All right.
Thank you for continuing to tune in to Good God. This program is available, as many of you already know, in various formats. You can take it as a podcast that is delivered to all the places you would go, whether Apple Podcasts or Google Play. And you can hear it weekly, and you can subscribe to it. A new episode drops every Thursday morning, and so we invite you to do that and subscribe. You can also find the video format in various places on the Facebook page, where we invite you to like Good God. You can also find it on YouTube and on Vocal Now, VOKALNOW.com, Vocal Now. So these are various places you can go. I'd also want to tell you that you can go to the website. That's www.goodgodproject.com. goodgodproject.com, and there you can find an archive of all of our previous episodes. If you like what you hear on any given week, you might actually like to have a transcript of the conversation. And if you go to the website, goodgodproject.com, you can find a transcript there also, where you can cut and paste and use what's been said in that conversation. So we'd invite you to find various ways to continue to tune in and to enjoy these conversations. One special thing I want to say is thank you to the friends of this program who have contributed financially to make it possible for us to do this without inviting you to have to give. We're grateful for the support of friends of this program, and I hope that you will be too. Please tell your friends about Good God and continue to tune in. Thanks for being part of it. We're back with Gerald Britt. Gerald, we were talking about the black church and its role in Dallas, but that also goes to a question of why we have to be talking about a black experience in Dallas and a white experience in Dallas. Why can't we have one city of Dallas? And there's a long history to this tension and how we have accommodated this in order to have a city. The phrase, the accommodation, is one that you hear in the wind a lot in Dallas, but it has a very specific history to it. Can you describe what that is?
Yeah, well, the accommodation is the title of Jim Schutz's book, Jim
Right.
Schutz, who writes for the Dallas Observer. And it reflects upon a time, late 50s into the 60s and 70s, where leadership, particularly in the black community, was an accommodation to the desires of the white community, not to disrupt, if you will, civic life in Dallas.
Right.
And so desegregation in Dallas happened not through protest and demonstration, but by fiat, and a recognition that Dallas would not be an attractive place to visit or to live if we had the same type of disruption that you had in Birmingham or in Selma.
Right.
And so there was leadership in Dallas that had ties to white leadership that would allow the selection, if you will, of leaders whom they found acceptable and untroubling to rise to be candidates for city council and the like, and that did not it didn't produce the altogether lack of tension, because even on school boards and city councils, these were leaders who had to fight for credibility.
Yeah.
And fight for respect and fight to have their voices heard. But that's kind of the way it happened. And I don't know if you remember when the Brown versus Board of Education ruling came down from the City Council, from the Supreme Court. There was this film that was made that was supposed to have gotten Dallas ready for desegregation. And the film does not have one black or brown face in it.
Wow.
But it speaks to whites actually telling them to act respectable and to understand that the law had changed or whatnot, but didn't have any pictures of black or brown children, didn't have any voices of African Americans talking about this change. It was directed towards whites. That is kind of the way the accommodation worked.
Right.
And so what it produced is what a lot of us refer to as in Dallas as a boil that hasn't been lanced in Dallas.
Okay. All right.
And people are still afraid of lancing that boil because they're afraid of the ugliness that might spill out.
Well, so the Urban Institute came out with its study that said that Dallas came in 274th out of 274 major cities in America in terms of its inequalities that are mainly racial and economic inequalities here in Dallas. So the net effect over time of the way we have done business in Dallas, the way our politics has been structured, the way our neighborhoods and our schools have been structured, the consequence of all of that has not been just to create a society in which everyone participates well and eagerly and flourishes, but instead a deep divide that exists. In my 30 years in Dallas, I haven't seen a time that has been more precarious. That I don't think that the white community in Dallas understands just how much seething anger, resentment, and frustration exists because of this long history and this lack of willingness to address directly the things that are about the everyday life of black Dallas folks, and not just the African American community. I think it's felt in the Latino community as well. But as we try to look at what happens at City Council, as we try to think about issues of affordable housing and about education and about all these sorts of things, there is a racial factor to almost everything we do in Dallas.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of white supremacy that literally seeps through our entire existence, unknown and unbeknownst to many of us in terms of how it affects our everyday living. Be it from Confederate monuments to the meager attempts at equity in the city council and the school district. All of that has to do with white supremacy and whites feeling as if they're giving something. To
Right. It's about our charitable instincts. But we created a structure, a system of life together that disproportionately advantaged one people and disadvantaged another, and then we also are asking for credit when we give generously certain kinds of gifts back in some way, which is not the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be that everyone is deserving of their own place.
Well, we have at City Square we have a book club every month, and there've been some older white supporters who have come from now, and when we would talk about race, their complaint would be, you talk about this as if there's been no progress. And when you stop and think about it, the 100 years from the period after slavery ended to just say 1963, 1965, was one of the most brutal periods of segregation and Jim Crow, in which people were lynched with impunity,
Right.
raped without accountability, economically deprived in some of the most heinous ways that you can figure. And to say that you don't give us any credit for you mean you want credit for being human.
Right.
You want credit for treating me as if I'm a human being.
Right.
And which does not inure to any type of benefit that suggests my equality or equity with equity of opportunity. And so that is where we've got to move to now.
Well, it's where we have to move to, and it seems to me that we are in a place where now we can't continue to just ignore these realities that you've talked about and to pretend that we can just make small incremental progress.
Right.
We have to take on structurally what is wrong inside of us and what is wrong outside of us, and do this as a complementary matter. I feel like the white church has said, and elements of the black church as well, change a person's heart and then everything will change.
Right.
Well, that's actually not the way the biblical prophet spoke of it. It's not the way Jesus spoke of it.
Right.
But it is the way the church has largely avoided getting in trouble with each other and with people in public. But it doesn't seem to connect. You change your heart with God, and we don't see the net effect of that in terms of the way we do business, the way we choose our schools, the way we have our children integrate. It stays the same.
Exactly. Yeah, I had a friend of mine who I love dearly, and she was telling me that she was saying that I'm trying to change the world one person at a time.
Yeah.
And I told her, I said, we'll all be dead by then.
Yeah.
That there has to be some substantive change that takes place over time. But we all have to be made somewhat uncomfortable. And you and I talked a little bit earlier.
Let's go ahead and hit me with it, Gerald. Go ahead and hit me with it, because we go way back.
Yeah.
And so there's a conversation that you and I have in my office years and years ago.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So go ahead and talk about this.
Yeah, but I'd come over there to talk to you about becoming a member of Dallas Area Interfaith and explaining to you what we do and all that. And I think we drifted into a conversation about race and challenging congregations and whatnot. And so, at a certain point you said, well, Gerald, nobody wants to be uncomfortable. And I thought about that, and I said, okay, that's where he is. And that's fine. You and I have remained friends over the years. I've watched you grow in that regard. And I've
Thank God.
And I've watched in a number of your sermons that you preach here at Wilshire. And I said, well, it looks like he's trying to make people uncomfortable now.
Yeah, that's what they would say too, I'm afraid.
But I think to build substantive relationships that last over time, where neither one of you go away from the table. Neither one of you stop talking. Neither one of you stop talking about the things that are important to one another. Neither one of you, where you get to the point where you're actually listening to someone and not just waiting to hear somebody else talk. That's where this begins. And that happens over time. The idea that you talked about when you talked about one segment of the population exercising its dominance to the disadvantage of another, that is the definition of racism. And people don't get that. People think that racism is just simply, you don't like me because I'm white, or you don't like me because I'm black. Racism has to do with power. Racism has to do with the ability to impact through policy, through economics, the way another person lives. And to the degree that we begin to take that seriously is a degree that we'll see just how badly a whole segment of our population is doing. The lack of not only economic resources, but the lack of educational opportunity, the lack of jobs, the lack of transportation, the lack of health care.
Right.
All of that is sourced out of racism.
Right.
And if we don't get that straight, we'll be able to put some Band-Aids on this wound. But again, we'll never be able to fully lance this boiling and let this poison out so that we can all be better.
Well, I want to thank you for hanging in there with me over the years, and we laugh about that, but it's not really a laughing matter.
Right.
This is part of what our duty is to each other,
Right.
In part as fellow Christians, as brothers in Christ, as part as ministers, part as just human beings who are neighbors, who have to pay attention to one another. And unfortunately, we do find ourselves in a position right now, I fear, in our country where we aren't being patient with one another.
Right.
I understand the impatience, but if we fall out of relationship with that impatience,
Right.
we don't give anybody a chance to grow.
Exactly.
And God knows we want things to change quickly, and maybe there are strategies for that to happen, of course. But over the long course of time, we have to know one another.
Right.
So thank you for your patience and for your, for your deliberate consistency over all these years. We have a lot more to talk about. We're going to do another episode. So Thanks for being with us on Good God.
Well, thank you.
We'll come back.
All right.